All right. Well, hopefully it will fix itself. So, thank you guys for coming out tonight to UACNJ. I appreciate you guys all making the reservation, wearing the face covers. I see we all brought some chairs, which is a very, very good thing to get comfortable. We have a great talk for you guys tonight. Bill Murray is going to be doing this fantastic presentation tonight. Isn't Beetlejuice a weird movie from the 1980s? So, what does that even mean? Well, Beetlejuice is a star. Bill's going to let you guys know how the stars got their names. After Bill's presentation, Kim is going to come up here and run you folks through just a couple details on observing and on how we're going to utilize our gift shop. And at the end, we're also going to answer some questions as well. So before I turn this over to Bill tonight, I just want to make sure that if you guys do social media, that you can find us on YouTube at UACNJ. We're also on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Same handle, UACNJ, United Astronomy Clubs of New Jersey. And with that being said, Bill's going to tell you how did these...
Okay. Good? Okay. So the title of the talk this evening is How the Stars Got Their Names. So during the winter, if you're out in the evening, you'll get to see this constellation. If you want to see it at this time of year, you have to get up right before the sun rises and look in the east. This is the famous constellation of Orion. The outline of Orion, he's a great hunter in the nighttime sky. And several of the brighter stars that make up the outline of his constellation, including several here that have names. We have Rigel down in his knee, and the other leg is Siph. And then up in his shoulder here, we have a star called Betelgeuse. And you might think, Betelgeuse? Seriously? How does a star get a name like that? And I'm here to tell you that. 100 BCE, the Alexandrians were very intent on getting the original copies of the Greek tragedies. The famous plays that we all learn in high school, Oedipus Rex, Antigone, many of the others, were all kept in the temples in Athens, and they were the original handwritten copies by the playwrights themselves. And the Athenians regarded them as a treasure, and they were very, very reluctant to lend them to the Alexandrians. And the Alexandrians said, we'll give you a small mountain of gold as surety that you'll get your plays back. And so the Athenians thought about it, and they finally said, okay. And then after the Alexandrians had the plays, they said, you guys keep the gold. We don't care about that. We're going to keep the plays. And to add insult to injury, they actually sent the Athenians back copies of their original plays to put back in their temples. So this place was the premier center of knowledge in the world at that time. And a few hundred years later, one of its most famous residents was this gentleman, Claudius Ptolemy. He lived there about the year 150 of the Common Era. He was the main astronomer of the library at that time. And he wrote a book called the Syntaxis. He's most famous, actually, because he was the founder of what we now call the geocentric model of the solar system, the model that says the Earth is at the center of the solar system and the sun, the moon, and all the planets orbit around the Earth. That model is wrong, but he actually was sophisticated enough with it to get it to reasonably well predict the positions of the moon, the stars, and the planets in the nighttime sky. So about the year 150, he wrote a book called the Syntaxis to be a compilation of everything that was known about astronomy at that time. And in addition to all the astronomical knowledge, including his description of the geocentric model of the solar system, he also included a star catalog at the end of his work of all the known stars at that time. He didn't do that research himself. He took the list from another Greek astronomer called Hipparchus, who lived a few hundred years before him. Hipparchus's work was later lost, so we only know about it through the copies that were made by Ptolemy. And here is a translated list of one of the pages in the star catalog in the Syntaxis. So you can see here, stars are listed by constellations, and down here at the bottom you'll see the constellation of Orion, and if you look for the third entry down, it says the bright red star in the right shoulder, this one here, the one we now call Betelgeuse. So the stars in the catalog didn't have proper names as such. They were identified by the position in the traditional figure of the constellation, the star in the shoulder, the star in the leg, and so forth, and also its position relative to the ecliptic and its latitude and longitude, as well as its brightness. So all the stars in the Syntaxis were listed that way. A few hundred years after Ptolemy's time, the Roman Empire, which controlled Egypt that time, fell, and most of the knowledge of that had been accumulated up to then was lost, at least in Western Europe, and all of the copies of the Syntaxis in Western Europe were lost as well. A few hundred years after that, Islamic adventurers and military units began to expand out from Saudi Arabia, what we know of as Saudi Arabia today, after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, to conquer much of what was the Eastern Roman Empire as well as other parts of the world. And they expanded out into what we now know as the Middle East, across North Africa, and into what is now Turkey. When they did that, they found some of the few remaining copies of the Syntaxis. And Arab astronomers were very interested in finding those, because it turns out that the religion of Islam is very closely tied to having some astronomical knowledge. Muslims pray, when they pray, they face Mecca. So if you're designing a mosque, you need to know which way that is. So you need a little bit of spherical astronomy to be able to figure that out. Also pray at various times of the day, so you need to be able to keep time fairly well. So the early Arabs were very good astronomers, and when they found this fount of knowledge that Ptolemy had created several hundred years before, they translated it into Arabic and spread it throughout their empire. So those Arab astronomers translated the Syntaxis into Arabic. They also gave the book the name that we now know it by, the Almagest, which means the greatest in Arabic. And if you go to their listing for the constellation of Orion and look at that bright red star in the shoulder of Orion, that got translated, and I'm not an Arabic speaker, so I'm probably going to mess this up, as Ibn al-Juz, the armpit of the giant. A few hundred years later, those Arabic copies made their way into what is now known as Western Europe, mainly through Spain. And the scholars and clerics who got a hold of them were interested, but they didn't know Arabic all that well. So when they saw Ibn al-Jawza, they translated that as Bed al-Jawza, which we now know of as Betelgeuse. So the rather roundabout path that most stars that have common names got them is the same way that Betelgeuse did. So many of the stars that have proper names come from European mistranslations of Arabic translations of the positions in stars in Ptolemy's catalog. Okay? So some of my favorite star names. Okay? In the constellation of Libra, you'll find these two, Zubin el-Janubi and Zubin esh-Shamali. Try saying those 3 times fast. Okay? So what do they translate as? Zubin el-Janubi translates as the southern claw, and Zubin esh-Shamali translate as the northern claw. And you may ask yourself, claws? What do claws have to do with scales? The constellation of Libra is a set of scales, right? And the answer is nothing. If you take a look at where Libra is, you'll see that it's directly in front of the constellation of Scorpius. And back in Ptolemy's time, the constellation of Libra actually didn't exist. It was considered to be part of the constellation of Scorpius. And so the star names come from that time period, where Zubin Eshemali was actually supposed to be the tip of the northern claw of the scorpion, and Zubin el-Janubi was supposed to be the southern tip of the scorpion. It wasn't until several hundred years after Ptolemy that people realized we have 12 months of the year, we really should have 12 constellations of the zodiac. So they peeled off this section of Scorpius and turned it into a separate constellation, Libra, but didn't bother to change the star names when they did that. So the stars still have those names. Also, this is a constellation that's mostly visible in the fall and early winter. It's Cetus, the whale or the sea monster, which has several interesting stars in it. Mira and Deneb Kaitos, I'm going to talk about. So Mira translates as the wonderful. It's one of the few stars that actually have a proper name that doesn't originate from Ptolemy. It got that name from the Polish astronomer Johannes Hevelius in the year 1662, and he gave it that name because he discovered that Mira is a star that varies over time. That was a new discovery at that time. The stars can actually vary in brightness. And Mira is a star that in the span of about a year goes from a reasonably bright star in the night sky, not one of the brighter stars, but definitely one that's easily visible to the unaided eye, to a star that's so dim you need a relatively large telescope in order to be able to see it, and then back again. And Hevelius was the first one to realize that this star was actually changing in brightness in a regular pattern. When he realized that, he gave it this name, Mira, the wonderful. Also, at the back end of Cetus, we have Deneb Kaitos, which translates as the tail of the whale, which I always thought would be a great name for a seafood restaurant down by the shore, but I've never seen it. We also have, in the fall, coming up, the constellation of Aquarius, and you'll see several stars here, Sad al-Chabia, Sad al-Malek, and Sad al-Sud. And those, again, are also stars that don't originate from Ptolemy and have proper names. So they come from pre-Islamic Arabia, and Sad al-Chabia translates as the lucky star of the tents, Sad al-Malek translates as the lucky star of the king, and Sad al-Sud translates as the luckiest of the lucky. So if you've ever seen the phrase, thank your lucky stars, there they are, right there. You can thank them when you see them in the nighttime sky. A few hundred years after those original copies of the Almagest made it into Europe, the Renaissance began, and people began to be interested in doing science again after a span of about 1,500 years when they really weren't. And one of the first sciences that they turned to was astronomy. And they realized that the system that Ptolemy had generated, which had been good for many hundreds of years, was really inadequate. There were only a few hundred stars that actually had proper names, and you can actually see, if you get to a good sky and with dark skies, several thousand stars. So they needed to develop a system that would allow for more star names, and also would allow them to be easy to remember, and if it was a really good system, it would tell you a little bit of something about the star just by saying the name. And the first person to tackle this problem was this gentleman, Johann Bayer. His years are there, 1572 to 1625. He was a German lawyer and amateur astronomer, and he decided that he would use the letters of the Greek alphabet, alpha, beta, and etc., as well as a generative form of the Latin name of the constellation to name the stars. The general system which he applied was the brightest star in any constellation would get the designation alpha, second brightest beta, and so on. So here's a list of all the letters in the Greek alphabet. Alpha, beta, the first two, A and B. The one we all remember from high school is pi, down here, all the way to omega. And as you can see, there are 24 letters in the Greek alphabet, so we can be allowed to name 24 stars in a constellation. In the constellation of Orion, Betelgeuse is actually the brightest star, so it gets the Bayer designation Alpha Orionis. Rigel is second brightest, so it gets the designation Beta Orionis. Bayer generally followed this plan by most of the constellations. There are a few exceptions, Ursa Major being one of them, where the alpha star is not the brightest star in the constellation. but mostly he followed this plan. There are a couple of stars that are actually better known by their Bayer designation than by their proper name. The constellation of Centaurus, which we can't actually see very well from here in New Jersey. You have to go south of the equator to get a good view of it. The brightest star in that constellation has a name of Rigel Kentaurus, but it's much better known by its Bayer designation, Alpha Centauri. And that's a star that's come up very often in science fiction movies and also in writing. If you're my generation, you remember back in the 1960s and 1970s, the television show Lost in Space. That's the star they were trying to get to, Alpha Centauri, when they got lost on that planet that they spent the whole series on. Okay? So, as we said, there are 24 letters in the Greek alphabet, so you can name up to 24 stars in a given constellation. In a few places, they extended that system by adding superscripts to the names. So, for instance, we'll see when we take a look at the constellation of Orion a little later. There's a Pi star, but there's also a Pi 1, Pi 2. So you can get a few more names out of that. But one thing that Bayer's designation does do is it cleans up the star maps a little bit. So here's the constellation of Orion using Bayer's system. So you see here the star in the shoulder is the Alpha star, so all we have is the Greek letter there, not the name. Down here in the leg is Beta, and you see all the other stars have Greek letter designations by them. So it does make the star maps a lot cleaner. Problem is, technology advances. So a few hundred years, or not a few hundred, but just a few years after Bayer's death, the telescope was invented by Galileo, and people started looking at the skies through telescopes, and now we don't have thousands of stars to name, we have tens of thousands of stars to name. So now Bayer's system, which was actually pretty good for its time, is inadequate. We need a new system. So we need a system, really, that would allow an unlimited number of stars to be named in a constellation. And the gentleman who first came up with that system is this gentleman, John Flamsteed, 1646 to 1719. He was the first royal astronomer of Great Britain, Astronomer Royal. And he decided that Bayer's general system was good, okay, but it was just limited. So he decided instead of Greek letters, we'll use integers, okay? So we're going to have stars numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, along with the constellation name, starting in the west and heading towards the east. So in Flamsteed's system, Betelgeuse has the designation 58 Orionis. Okay. We also have variable stars. And if you thought the names for stars that we've gone over so far are confusing, we haven't even begun yet. Okay. Because variable stars are a very good, the naming convention for variable stars is a very good example of how science advances. And we try to figure out one system for naming objects, and then very soon after that find out that that system is not adequate. Do they throw out the system completely? Not if they can help it. What they usually do is try to expand the system or build on it, and only throw it out if it becomes completely unworkable. And an example of that is in the convention for naming variable stars. As we said, talking about Mira, stars do vary in brightness, and that was, excuse me, a discovery that was only made in the 1600s. By a century later, only a few other variable stars had been found. So we want a convention to name variable stars. And the convention that astronomers came up with was this one. So if a variable star is discovered in a constellation and it already has a common name, a Bayer or a Flamsteed designation, it keeps that name and doesn't get a new name. Okay, so we don't have to rename stars yet again. So if it does not have one of those designations, it gets the designation R. Why not A? Well, at the time that they were figuring out this system, letters from A to R had been used extensively in astronomy for other things. So they didn't want the confusion going on, so they said, okay, the alphabet from like R on is pretty unused, we'll start there. Okay? So, for instance, the first unnamed variable star in the constellation of Andromeda got the designation R Andromedae. Okay? After that, the names proceeded from S to C all the way to Z. Okay? That allows for 9 variable stars to be named per constellation. This system was figured out by this gentleman, German astronomer Friedrich Wilhelm Argelander, 1799 to 1875. He created this system under the impression that since variable stars were fairly rare, it was unlikely that we would need more than 9 names per constellation to name all the variable stars in the night sky. He was mistaken, badly mistaken. Okay? So it was discovered, okay, we're finding a lot more variable stars in constellations than we thought there were. This system is going to be inadequate. We need to expand it. Okay. So then they said, okay, instead of using 1 letter, we'll use 2. So after going through the Z star, the next variable star that was discovered got the designation RR, and then RS, RT through RZ, and that would name the 10th through the 18th stars. And then the 19th would get the designation SS, because they didn't want to have confusion. You can have an RS star, but you'll never have an SR star. Okay? So that removes that level of confusion. That names the 19th through the 26th variable stars, all the way through ZZ. That allows for up to 54 variable stars to be named per constellation. Is that enough? No. So, okay, when it was realized we're going to need more than 54 names per constellation, they said, all right, well, we haven't touched the beginning of the alphabet yet, so let's go back to AA again. And so the 55th star was named AA, then AB through AQ, right? And then BB, BC through BQ, all the way through QQ. And that allowed for a total of 334 variable stars to be named for constellation. The letter J was omitted. Why was the letter J omitted? Nobody remembers. Okay. So finally, 334 variable stars per constellation. Is that enough? No. And at that point, astronomers threw up their hands and said, okay, this is not working. We need a new system. So the 335th variable star gets the designation V335, and then V336, and then V337, and so on. So now we finally have enough names, but all these other naming conventions still exist. So if you're looking to find a variable star in a constellation, they have 1-letter designations. Those are the early ones that were found. And then 2-letter designations, but the lower letters in the alphabet, like the AA star, were discovered after the letters later in the alphabet. And finally, after that whole mess is done, any more are named V335, V336, and so on. Okay? That's the way, unfortunately, science works sometimes. Okay? Try to figure out a system to name things when you really don't know how many things you're trying to name, and then you find out the system doesn't work, and then you're stuck with it. Okay? So a few variable stars of interest. Okay? So RR Lyrae. Okay, so this is the 10th variable star discovered in the constellation of Lyra. And if you can see here, it's actually pulsating. So these are variable stars that vary in brightness over the span of just a few hours. They're very important in the history of astronomy because it was discovered by the American astronomer Henrietta Swan Leavitt early in the 20th century that the period of the variation of these stars was directly related to their internal brightness. And that made these stars excellent standard candles. So if you find one of these stars and you can measure its period, which is relatively easy to do, you can figure out how intrinsically bright it is. And if you know how intrinsically bright it is, you can look at how bright it actually appears to you and use the difference between those two to figure out how far away it is. Because any light that's close is going to be bright, lights that are farther away are going to be dim. Okay, the brightness drops off as 1 over the distance squared. So it's relatively easy to use these stars to measure distances out in the universe. Also, this is a star that, if the weather clears up, we could see tonight, T Lyrae. Okay, it's a carbon star. There's a lot of carbon in the outer atmosphere of these stars, and that makes them appear red. Generally, you don't see a lot of colors in telescopes because the human eye is very insensitive to light at low light levels. But these are one of the few examples where you can see brilliant colors through a telescope. So most stars look white or various shades of white when you look at them through the telescope. These kind of stars look like a little drop of blood on the sky when you see one. They're very impressive. Yeah. So the question is, which of these systems that I've talked about so far do we use today? And the unfortunate answer that I have to tell you is all of them. Okay, so this is a modern star map of the constellation of Orion. So you can see here we have proper names from the mistranslations of Ptolemy's catalog. Other stars have Bayer designations. There's Rho, Kappa, Beta. See if we can find a few notes. There's Gamma, Mu. Okay, so some stars have Bayer designations. Other stars have Flamsteed designations. So 22, 23, 33, 51. Those are Flamsteed designations, as well as variable stars. So BL, W, so we can find some others here. 3, no, 3. There's a few others in there, but I don't know how to find them now. So this is what we're stuck with today. We have a variety of different systems that name the stars. Unfortunately, I got to tell you, that's the way it is. It's probably not going to change. So let's take a look at a few special stars. So stars that are named after people. A few stars are named after people. It's usually the astronomer who discovered them or discovered something interesting about them, but not always. So another star that is visible this evening, and it is clearing up, so that's a good thing, is called Barnard Star, named after the American astronomer Edward Emerson Barnard. Lived in the late 19th century and observed with some of the bigger telescopes in the United States at that time. And he discovered this star, and it is actually the fourth closest star to us here on the Earth and the star with the largest proper motion. Stars do not appear to move very much because for the most part, they're very, very far away. So the constellations that we see today are the same as the constellations that the ancient Greeks and Romans were looking at thousands of years ago. And they will be around for thousands of years more. It takes tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of years for the stars to move enough to change the form of the constellations. But if a star is nearby, its apparent motion is much greater. So this star, which is in the constellation Ophiuchus, actually appears to move over the time spans that are reasonable. So here's a picture of the star in 1991 to a picture of the star in 2007. So if you take pictures of the stars as it goes by, you can actually see it moving over just a few years through the nighttime sky. We have Herschel's Garnet Star, Mu Cephei, Bayer designation, discovered by the astronomer William Herschel, one of my favorite people in the history of astronomy. I'll have more to say about him in just a few minutes. It's a supergiant star, and it's noted for its very orange color. So this star is one of the few stars where you don't actually need any optical aid to see color in it. If you know where to look at, you can see it in the nighttime sky, and you can actually see that it has an orangish tint to it. We have Hind's Crimson Star, R. Leporis, another variable star, discovered by the English astronomer John Russell Hind. It's also one of the reddest stars in the nighttime sky, another carbon star. Unfortunately, this one's visible in the winter sky, so you won't be able to see it in the evening sky for another few months. And finally, we have this star, Cor Caroli, which begins a saga of people trying to name stars to curry political favor with the leaders of their countries, which is something that happens occasionally in time. So we'll take a look at a couple of examples of that. This is a very nice, bright double star in the constellation of Canis Venatici. And it was originally discovered by Edmund Halley in the late 1600s. And at that time, England was going through a period known as the Restoration. England had gone through a civil war, and the king had actually been beheaded, Charles I, right here. A few years later, his son, Charles II, was restored to the throne, and in order to curry favor with the new king, Halley named this star Cor Caroli, which means the heart of Charles. He was naming it after the king's father, who was generally treated as a martyr by the English royalty because he was killed by the English revolutionaries. So Halley was trying to curry a little bit of favor with the new king by naming the star after his murdered father. Here's another example of that didn't quite work out so well. So in the handle of the Big Dipper is a star called Mizar, okay? And if you look closely at it, you'll see that there's another star very close to it called Alcor. It used to be a test of good eyesight if you could see both of them in the sky. And if you have a telescope, the system turns out to be more interesting because Mizar itself is a double star, and you can see that in even small telescopes. But if you look a little bit between them and off the line between them, there's a star there that has the name Sidus Ludovikiana. Okay, kind of strange name. It was discovered by the German astronomer Johann Georg Liebknecht. When he discovered it, he thought it was a new planet. It wasn't. But he named it after the king of the principality that he was under, Landgrave Louis of Hesse-Darmstadt, Ludwig's star, or Louis's star. When it turned out that the star was not a new planet, Liebknecht didn't get the political plum appointment that he thought he was going to get, but the name of the star stuck. So we still call it Sidus Ludovikiana. Okay. Back to William Herschel again. So this is a picture of Herschel. He has a very interesting story. He was born in Germany in the Principality of Hanover. His father was a musician, and he followed his father's line of work and became a musician in the Hanoverian army when he was about 18 years old. He didn't like the army life. It was not for him. So he went AWOL from the Hanoverian army and took a boat over to England, which was probably a good thing because when he did that, the 7 Years' War was about to start, and the Hanoverian army was involved in the 7 Years' War heavily during that time, so he avoided that. But when he was in England, he gave music lessons in the city of Bath, which is where he settled, mainly to upper-class English people. And one of the people he gave music lessons to couldn't pay him, and so said, well, instead of paying you, I'll give you this. He gave him a telescope making kit. And Herschel said, okay, and played around with the kit and became fascinated with making telescopes and using them, and became a very avid amateur astronomer. So this is a picture of him in his backyard, along with his sister, Caroline, who also became a very famous astronomer, looking at the nighttime sky. And he spent every free moment that he had scanning the skies with telescopes that he made. The telescopes that he made were actually quite a bit bigger than the telescopes that professional astronomers were using at the time. He could see a lot more with them. And one of the things that he saw was this. One night he discovered this small blue-green object in the nighttime sky and was interested in it, tracked it over a few weeks, and realized it was moving. And if something is moving over that time period, it's actually in our solar system. So the original question was, what is it? Is it a planet? Is it a comet? And Herschel made his discovery known to the professional astronomers at that time, who had the mathematics to be able to figure out its orbit. And they figured out that it was actually a new planet. And when they discovered that, Herschel became famous immediately throughout Europe. He was the first human being to discover a new planet in thousands of years. All the other planets had been known since antiquity. This was the first new one that was discovered. So as the discoverer, Herschel got the right to name the new planet, and people asked him what he was going to name the planet, and he thought about it, and he said, okay, we'll call it Georgium Sidus. Here's the orbit of Georgium Sidus. That translates as George's star, named after King George III of England, who doesn't really have a very good reputation on this side of the Atlantic because he was the king who the American revolutionaries were revolting against in the American Revolution. But in England, he was a great patron of the sciences and the arts. And he was fascinated by Herschel's discovery and flattered that Herschel had decided to name it after him. So he gave Herschel a job. He named him the King's Astronomer with an annual salary of £200, which was a really good salary back in the 18th century. Also, luckily, besides being King of England, he was also King of Hanover. So he granted Herschel a pardon for deserting from the Hanoverian army all those years before, and also gave him £500 to begin construction of the largest telescope in the world, a feat which Herschel accomplished 3 times. So 3 times he built the largest telescope in the world, and so he began his life as an amateur astronomer. All of us are amateur astronomers. When he ended his life, he was the most famous astronomer in the world and actually founded a dynasty of astronomers. His sister became a very famous astronomer after him, one of the first women astronomers to be recognized, and his son was also an astronomer and was named Astronomer Royal of England. So a few other stars that are named after people. So this is a small constellation visible now in the east called Delphinus the Dolphin. And it has 2 stars in it that are pretty easily visible to the unaided eye. And those 2 stars have the names Swalloson and Rotnev, which are kind of odd names. How did those stars get those names? And initially people didn't know. They don't go back to Ptolemy. Where did they come from? And after a little detective story, they originally discovered that the stars' names go back to this catalog called the Palermo Catalog, which was compiled by this gentleman, Giuseppe Piazzi, who was an Italian astronomer at that time. He was mostly famous for discovering the second planet that was known after Herschel had discovered Uranus. He discovered the Minor Planets series. And so he had an assistant, Niccolo Cacciatore. And it was common back then that scientific papers were written in Latin. And when you wrote a paper in Latin, you translated your name into Latin when you signed the paper. So Niccolo Cacciatore's Latin name was Nicholas Venator. And if you take a look at it, Swalloson is Nicholas spelled backwards, and Rotnev is Venator spelled backwards. So it's postulated that Piazzi was very pleased with the work his assistant was doing for him and decided to honor him by kind of surreptitiously naming 2 stars in his catalog that didn't have names already with these names, which was variations on his name, where they would just know the story but no one else would. But people figured it out eventually. You would think that story is odd enough that to be unique in the history of astronomy. It isn't. So here's a modern version of that story. Okay, late 1960s, early 1970s. Star catalogs started coming up with the names of 3 stars in the constellations of Vela, Cassiopeia, and Ursa Major. Those stars were named Reger, Navi, and Denosis. And initially, nobody could figure out where these names come from. They hadn't been published in any previous catalogs, but all of a sudden, catalogs and star maps that were being printed in the late 1960s and early 1970s started having these star names. So where did they come from? Okay. So here's a star map with those names on them. So here's Denosis in the constellation Ursa Major. There's the Big Dipper. Navi in Cassiopeia, and Reger down here in Vela. And a clue is down here in the lower left-hand corner. You'll see that this was a map created for the Apollo 11 moon mission. Okay. So in the late 1960s, the United States was heavily involved in trying to get the first human beings to land on the moon. And that project was called the Apollo program. And it was unlike any other space program that had gone on before, because previous to that, all astronauts, and since that as well, all astronauts have been in what are called low Earth orbit. Okay? If you're in low Earth orbit, you really don't need a lot of navigational beacons. You can get radio signals from the Earth. You're close enough to the Earth that you can just look down and figure out where you are. But for the Apollo mission, astronauts had to travel from the Earth to the Moon and then back again, a distance of more than 240,000 miles. The Earth is moving through space. The Moon is moving through space. So if you want to successfully make it from the Earth to the Moon, you have to use celestial navigation to figure out where you are. Okay? So you can fire the rockets at the right time in order to correctly enter the orbit of the Moon and then correctly make it back to the Earth. Okay? So the Apollo astronauts had to learn celestial navigation, and when they were using stars, they wanted a set of stars that they could use for celestial navigation. They didn't care about numbers, they didn't care about Bayer designations or Flamsteed designations or anything like that. They wanted names. Okay? And if a star didn't have a name, but it was useful for navigation, well, they gave it one. Okay? So this is the first of the Apollo missions. Is my laser gone out? I think I've worn my batteries out. So this is the, oh, there we go. So these three gentlemen were the crew of Apollo 1. Edward H. White II, who was the first American to walk in space. Virgil I. Gus Grissom, the second American in space and one of the original Mercury 7 astronauts. And Roger Chaffee, who was a rookie. This would have been his first space flight. Unfortunately, a few weeks before the space mission was supposed to launch, the astronauts were doing a test in the Apollo capsule on the launch pad, and a fire ripped through the capsule, and all three of the astronauts were killed. And so, if you take a look at those three names, okay, we have Virgil I. Grissom. The I stands for Ivan. Okay, Navi is Ivan spelled backwards. Edward H. White II. Denosis is second spelled backwards. And Roger B. Chaffee, Roger is Roger spelled backwards. So it's postulated that after the astronauts died, their colleagues named those stars after them to honor them, but did it in a way that wouldn't be immediately obvious. And astronomy publications like Sky and Telescope and Astronomy Magazine saw these maps that were published by NASA and said, well, it's NASA. They must know what they're doing, and just carried on the names without bothering to check where they came from. And so that's where that came from. So we've talked about stars named for people. How about a few examples of people who are named after stars? Okay? Probably the most prominent one we've seen in the last few years. If you're a fan of Harry Potter, have Sirius Black, who was Harry Potter's godfather and one of the founders of the Order of the Phoenix. He also had a brother called Regulus Arcturus Black. Thank you, J.K. Rowling, for that. Here's one that's a little more involved. The legend of Perseus and Andromeda. One of the interesting things about the constellations that are visible in the fall is that they're all linked by the same ancient story, a myth called the legend of Perseus and Andromeda, which goes something like this. Back in ancient times, Cassiopeia was said to be the queen of Ethiopia, along with her husband, King Cepheus, both constellations now. And Cassiopeia was said to be a very beautiful woman, but she was very vain and boastful. And one day she made a really bad mistake and claimed that she was more beautiful than the sea nymphs, who were the goddesses of the sea at that time. This was a bad thing to do in ancient times. You didn't want to diss the ancient Greek gods like that. They would find ways to get even with you. And so the sea nymphs, being a little bit ticked off at this, complained to their boss, the sea god Poseidon. And his response was to send a big sea monster called Cetus, a constellation we already talked about, to destroy the coast of Ethiopia. And the monster wouldn't stop until Andromeda, who was Cassiopeia and Cepheus' daughter, was sacrificed to it. So Andromeda was chained to a big rock by the sea to await her fate, and she would have had a really bad day, except for the hero of the story. His name was Perseus. He'd had a busy day already. He had managed to kill another monster called the Gorgon Medusa. And the Medusa was an interesting creature. It had the body of a human woman, but its hair was made up completely of snakes. and anyone who was unfortunate enough to look directly at it was turned instantly into stone. Perseus had managed to kill a monster by fighting it while only looking at its reflection reflected in his shield. And luckily for Andromeda, he was carrying the head of Medusa with him when he chanced upon her and her problem that day. So thinking quickly, Perseus ran up to Cetus the sea monster and showed it the head of Medusa, being careful not to look at it himself. And Cetus was instantly transformed into a big rock in the sea, and Perseus and Andromeda lived happily ever after. So this is a modern figure of the constellation of Perseus, and you'll see here he's holding the head of Medusa. And the brightest star in the head of the Medusa is called Algol. That's one of those stars that come from Ptolemy's catalog, and that's actually a mistranslation. Algol is the second brightest star in Perseus, and in the Almagest, that star was actually named Ras Al Ghul, the head of the demon. That's what translation from Arabic is. And it's considered to be unlucky. It's an eclipsing binary star, one of the brightest known, one of the earliest discovered. So these are two stars that are orbiting around each other, and the orbit takes a few days for one star to go around the other. When the brighter star is in front of the dimmer star, you get a small dip in brightness. But when the dimmer star rotates so that it's in front of the brighter star, there's a bigger dip in brightness for a few hours. So this is a star, if you know when to look and where to look in the nighttime sky, you can actually see over the span of 3 or 4 hours the star will decrease in brightness by a factor of about 2.5, which may be the reason why it was considered unlucky, because ancient peoples could have actually seen this and realized there's something odd going on with that star. So where else do we see here about Ras Al Ghul? Well, if you're a fan of Batman, he is the head of the League of Assassins and Batman's nemesis in the Dark Knight trilogy. So how about now, modern star names? As I said, technology advances, so telescopes get bigger and bigger. We now don't have tens of thousands of stars to name, we have hundreds of millions. And with that number of stars to be able to name, any naming system you can come up with is not going to be adequate for that. So now, astronomers usually use the star's coordinates or some sort of numerical system. Happily, we have computers now, so they can process that data and sort them and find stars by using computer searches. Probably the last written star catalog that was created is this one, the Smithsonian Astrophysical Observatory Catalog, or SAO catalog, which was published in the 1960s, and catalog of 258,996 stars down to 9th magnitude. In that catalog, Betelgeuse is SAO 113271. Okay. In the 1990s, people actually started sending space missions up to map stars. The first one, and one of the most famous, is the Hipparcos satellite. I think I'm losing my battery again. There we go. Which was in space from 1989 to 1993. Mapped the positions of 120,000 or so stars very accurately. And for the first time, people had access to digital star catalogs. So you could take a CD drive or a CD and put it into your computer, and it would have the list of all these 120,000 stars, their brightnesses and positions in the nighttime sky, which had some unintended consequences. So one of those consequences was the creation of companies that sell stars, and you may have seen some of these. Companies that will sell you a star that you can name for yourself, and they'll say they keep a record of that locked in their company vault or whatever. The problem is those names are not recognized for professional astronomers. So I'm just going to read off here the entry in Wikipedia on this. So International Star Registry and other companies that sell star names to the public, it is the opinion of many astronomers that such businesses are fraudulent because the names assigned by businesses are not recognized by the International Astronomical Union and have no official status. These companies have been urged to improve the information that they provide to customers before purchase to fully disclose the nature of what they were buying. Okay? Most people, when you go to buy a star, have no idea that there is an official designation for stars. Okay? And these companies are not in charge of that. So it can be a little bit of an issue of fraud. Okay? So just be aware of that if you ever think about buying a star. If you want to do it as a novelty, that's fine, but just be aware of what you're buying. So, talked about Betelgeuse all night. So some of the names for Betelgeuse. It's also in Bayer's designation, Alpha Orionis. In Flamsteed's designation, 58 Orionis. In the SAO catalog, SAO 113271. In the Hipparcos catalog, the digital catalog created by the Hipparcos satellite, it's star 27989. So when you go out tonight, unfortunately you can't do it now. If you stay around towards the evening, later in the morning you can. You can go in one of the telescopes and say to one of the astronomers running it, could you please show me SAO 113271 through the telescope? And that astronomer will immediately say, sure, it's right there, Betelgeuse. That's my talk this evening. I hope everybody enjoyed it. Please visit our gift shop in here. I believe they want one person in there at a time. And enjoy the evening, which actually turned out quite a bit better than I thought it would.
All right, guys. Thank you for coming out. Thank you, Bill, for our presentation. Are there any questions from the audience right now? Anything? Bueller? We alive? All right. At least I got some giggles. All right. We thank you very much. A couple of reminders. Off to my right, your left. We do have the porta potty if you should need it. When you are leaving, please use your headlights. It hurts to get run over by a car. And even though we temporarily have visibility issues on the ground, I'd much rather be able to see a person or see a car coming at me than get hit by a car. It's painful. We don't want to do that. Don't ask me how I know. So, off to my left, your right, we do have a couple of telescopes open with the view through them projected on screens. We do have that, guys, right? Okay.
Yeah, we have 2 scopes open.
We do have 2 scopes open currently. They will have various targets up, and feel free to ask the people running them any questions you have about that. Like Bill said, we do have a gift shop. Again, one person in at a time. If you did bring younger children or whatnot, you can come in as a group as long as it's just your immediate group that came with your car, no multiple groups at the same time. And thank you very much, guys.
Thank you for coming.